Welcome back to Warm Pages, where we warm hearts with stories as comforting as your morning coffee. I'm your host, Harry, and today we're steeping ourselves in the world of Miss Marple. Now tell me, isn't it wonderful how stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big world? Before we begin, I'd love to know which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from today? I'm reading every single one. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the Christmas Mystery. Chapter 1. The Vicar's Christmas Party. St. Mary Mead lay under a perfect blanket of snow, the kind that Christmas card artists endeavor to capture, but seldom achieve. The leaded windows of the cottages glowed with warm light, and the medieval church stood sentinel over the village, its ancient stones dusted with white powder that glittered in the fading afternoon light. It was, Miss Jane Marple thought, rather too perfect, like a stage set waiting for drama to unfold. Miss Marple adjusted her woolen scarf as she made her careful way along the path to the vicarage. Her old bones protested against the bitter cold, but she would not miss Reverend Clement's annual Christmas gathering for anything, particularly not this year. The 800th Christmas celebration of St. Mary Mead had brought unusual excitement to the sleepy village, primarily in the form of the Canterbury Psalter, a magnificent 12th century illuminated manuscript on temporary loan from Canterbury Cathedral. "Do mind the step, Miss Marple," called the vicar's wife, greeting her at the door. "The ice is treacherous tonight." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the welcoming warmth of the vicarage. The drawing-room beyond was transformed by evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and the soft glow of candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The air was fragrant with mulled wine and cinnamon. Miss Marple's observant eyes took in the assembly already gathered. Professor Harold Wilkins stood by the fireplace, a thin, stooped man with wire-rimmed spectacles, who seemed to wear his Oxford learning like a visible cloak. He was deep in conversation with the vicar about the manuscript he had arranged to bring to St. Mary Mead. Sir Thomas and Lady Hartwell were by the window, newcomers to the area who had purchased the old manor house. Sir Thomas, robust and red-faced with a military bearing, appeared entirely English, though Miss Marple had heard whispers of foreign connections. His wife was considerably younger, elegant in a green velvet dress that Miss Marple estimated had cost more than her own quarterly income. Mrs. Elaine Crawford was holding court near the punch bowl, her London sophistication slightly overdone for a village gathering. Miss Marple noted how she deftly avoided Professor Wilkins whenever he moved in her direction, a small detail but one that caught the elderly lady's attention. "Ah, Miss Marple, Dr. James Lockwood approached, offering her a glass of sherry. "How are your rheumatic pains in this weather?" "Much as one might expect, Doctor," she answered with a gentle smile. The new village doctor was a handsome man with an easy manner, though there was something in his keen interest in medieval history that struck Miss Marple as studied rather than natural. "I understand you've been most interested in our visitor from Canterbury." "Indeed," he replied, his eyes brightening. "Medieval manuscripts are something of a passion of mine. An unusual hobby for a country doctor, perhaps." "Not at all. We all have our little specialities, don't we?" Miss Marple's faded blue eyes met his with innocent inquiry. Throughout the evening, small groups were escorted into the vicar's study to view the precious manuscript. Miss Marple observed Dr. Lockwood and Professor Wilkins engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation near the display case, their voices too low to hear, but their rigid postures speaking volumes. Later she noticed Sir Thomas examining the manuscript with a level of expertise that seemed curious in a man who had introduced himself as merely a retired businessman. His wife, meanwhile, cast nervous glances toward Mrs. Crawford, who had yet to enter the study at all. As the clock approached 10, Reverend Clement tapped a spoon against his glass. "Friends, before we conclude our festivities, I invite you all to view our treasured guest one final time before it's secured for the night." The assembled guests moved toward the study, but the vicar's puzzled expression as he unlocked the door caused a ripple of concern. He stepped inside, then turned back, his face ashen. "The manuscript," he stammered. "The case, they're gone." In the confusion that followed, Colonel Bantry, with military efficiency, organized the men into search parties. It was only then that someone noticed Dr. Lockwood's absence. As midnight approached, heavy snow began to fall once more. Miss Marple stood with the vicar's wife at the window, watching the bobbing lanterns of the searchers in the darkness. The village had never seemed so hushed, so expectant. Then it came, a scream that cut through the silent night like a knife. Miss Marple felt her heart skip. Without a word, she reached for her coat. In the churchyard, illuminated by flashlights and the colored glow from the stained glass windows, a small crowd had already gathered. There, against the pristine snow, lay Dr. Lockwood, his open eyes staring unseeing at the heavens. From his chest protruded what Miss Marple recognized as the ornate letter opener from the vicar's desk, and in his rigid fingers was clutched what appeared to be a single page torn from an ancient text, the Latin words barely visible in the wavering light. Miss Marple pulled her coat closer against the chill that had nothing to do with the December air. She had seen too much of human nature to be truly shocked, but there was something particularly sacrilegious about murder at Christmas, a stain of scarlet upon the season of goodwill that no amount of snow could quite cover. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Snow. Morning arrived with a pearlescent light filtering through the heavy clouds, the snow having continued its silent work throughout the night. Miss Marple had risen early, her mind preoccupied with the events at the vicarage. She had just finished securing a woolen shawl around her shoulders when she heard the distinct sound of a motor car struggling through the snow-laden lanes of St. Mary Mead. From her window she observed a police vehicle making its laborious way toward the vicarage. That would be Inspector Craddock, she surmised, a capable man who had worked with her on a previous case, and who, unlike many of his colleagues, did not dismiss her observations as the ramblings of an elderly spinster. By 9:30, Miss Marple was ensconced in the vicar's drawing-room, ostensibly helping Mrs. Clement recover from the shock, but her bright eyes missed nothing of the official investigation unfolding around her. "The murder weapon is straightforward enough," Inspector Craddock informed her, having developed a healthy respect for her insights. A medieval letter opener from the vicar's desk, normally kept with his correspondence in the study, the very room from which the manuscript vanished, and the page found in the poor doctor's hand. Miss Marple inquired gently. "That's rather curious," the inspector replied, removing his spectacles to polish them. "Professor Wilkins has examined it. He's quite emphatic that it's not from the Canterbury Psalter at all." As if summoned by his name, the professor entered, his academic composure noticeably disturbed. "It's written in a rare form of medieval Latin," he explained, his fingers trembling slightly as he handled the evidence with gloved hands. "The Norman influence is unmistakable. It appears to contain part of a coded message or perhaps an obscure religious text." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple, her needles clicking as she knitted steadily. "And Dr. Lockwood, had you known him long, Professor?" A flicker of something, alarm perhaps, crossed Wilkins' features before he answered. "No, not at all. We'd never met before last night, though he claimed some familiarity with my academic work." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "How curious. I distinctly recall him mentioning to Mrs. Bantry a long-standing friendship with you." The professor's denial contradicted what Miss Marple herself had overheard, but she merely continued knitting, her expression benign. Village gossip, normally dismissed by official investigators, had already informed her that Dr. Lockwood had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 6 months prior, purchasing the practice from retired Dr. Haydock with what many considered suspicious haste and liquidity. Later that afternoon, while the police were occupied searching Dr. Lockwood's house, Miss Marple paid a social call on Lady Hartwell. The manor house was impressively decorated for Christmas, though the grandeur had a newly acquired quality that suggested unfamiliarity with old wealth. "Such a dreadful business," Lady Hartwell said, pouring tea with hands that betrayed a slight unsteadiness. "One doesn't expect murder in a village like St. Mary Mead." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple responded mildly. "Human nature is much the same everywhere, I find." Their conversation wandered to the topic of Dr. Lockwood, and Lady Hartwell remarked, "He had the most fascinating collection of medieval medical texts in his study. Quite valuable, I should imagine." "You visited his home, then?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. Lady Hartwell's cup clattered against its saucer. "No, that is, I merely heard from others in the village. One picks up these details, doesn't one?" Miss Marple nodded agreeably, though she knew for certain that Dr. Lockwood had entertained very few visitors, being somewhat reclusive outside his professional duties. Upon returning to the vicarage, she found Inspector Craddock in a state of subdued excitement. The search of Lockwood's house had yielded startling results. "A most unusual doctor," Craddock confided. His home contained an extensive library on medieval manuscripts, far beyond casual interest, and behind a false wall in his study, we discovered what can only be described as a forgery workshop: inks, aged papers, calligraphy tools. "How very enlightening," commented Miss Marple. "There's more," the inspector continued. "A collection of newspaper clippings about valuable manuscript thefts across Europe, dating back several years. As Miss Marple departed for her cottage, darkness was already descending, the short winter day yielding to a long night. The village lay hushed under its blanket of snow, and yellow lamplight spilled from windows onto the white ground. There was a deceptive tranquility to the scene that Miss Marple knew better than to trust. She had just settled before her fire, her knitting balanced on her lap, and her mind busy sorting through the day's revelations, when an urgent knocking disturbed the evening quiet. Opening her door, she found Mrs. Crawford on her doorstep, her usual sophisticated composure shattered, her face pale with terror. "Miss Marple," she gasped, "I didn't know where else to go. Someone has broken into my cottage." "My dear, you must come in at once." Miss Marple ushered her inside. "Shall I telephone the police?" "No." Mrs. Crawford's reaction was immediate and vehement, then more controlled. "No, it's not what they took, it's what they left behind." She opened her handbag with shaking fingers and withdrew an envelope. "This was on my pillow, secured with this." From the envelope, she produced a single page of illuminated manuscript, the gold leaf catching the firelight. The dagger that had pinned it to her pillow was an antique piece with an ornately carved handle. "You see," Mrs. Crawford began, but at that precise moment, the lights throughout the cottage flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Miss Marple heard the sharp sound of breaking glass from the direction of her small parlour, followed by a stifled cry from Mrs. Crawford. For a moment, there was utter stillness. Then, fumbling in the familiar darkness of her own home, Miss Marple located matches and a candle on the mantelpiece. As the small flame illuminated the room, she discovered herself to be quite alone. The French windows stood open to the garden, bitter air streaming in, and in the fresh snow lay a single set of footprints, leading away into the impenetrable darkness. Miss Marple moved to the window, peering out into the night. The footprints revealed a curious pattern, someone running but with an odd, halting rhythm. She had seen such tracks once before, years ago, made by her nephew when he had carried an injured friend from a boating accident. Someone had taken Mrs. Crawford, not dragging her unwillingly, but carrying her, and judging by the deepening indentations in the snow, she had been unconscious. Drawing her shawl closer, Miss Marple felt a most unseasonal chill settle over her. The Canterbury Psalter, it seemed, harboured secrets worth killing for, and whatever game was being played in St. Mary Mead this Christmas, she feared they had only witnessed the opening moves. Chapter 3. The Ancient Riddle. The pale winter sun had barely risen over the frost-laden trees when the news spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Mrs. Crawford had been found unconscious near the frozen village pond, a worrying gash on her temple, suggesting not an accident but a deliberate attempt on her life. By the time Miss Marple had finished her morning tea, the unfortunate woman had been transported to the county hospital, her condition described as serious but stable. "Most peculiar business," remarked Inspector Craddock, who had come directly to Miss Marple's cottage after examining the scene. "Footprints all around the pond, but the overnight snowfall has obscured most of them. We might never have found her if young Thomas, the baker's son, hadn't taken that shortcut on his morning deliveries." "Providence works in mysterious ways," murmured Miss Marple, reaching for her knitting. "I suppose you've had a look at Mrs. Crawford's cottage?" "Just come from there," Craddock confirmed, accepting a cup of tea. Signs of a methodical search, drawers opened, cupboards examined, yet nothing obviously missing. "Perhaps you wouldn't mind if I accompanied you back there," Miss Marple suggested. "Mrs. Crawford may have mentioned something to me last night that could be relevant." The cottage, a charming thatched affair at the edge of the village, showed all the signs of a too hasty decoration for Christmas, the work of someone unused to creating a home. Inside, the disarray confirmed Craddock's assessment of a thorough search. Miss Marple moved through the rooms with a seemingly aimless curiosity, but her faded blue eyes missed nothing. "Inspector," she said quietly, pausing by a wall in the sitting room, "does anything strike you as odd about this particular spot?" Craddock examined the wall, seeing nothing unusual until Miss Marple indicated a small, slightly discolored patch. "The wallpaper is faded everywhere except this rectangle," she pointed out. "A picture hung here until very recently, I'd say." "Observant as always, Miss Marple," Craddock acknowledged. "But why would a thief take a single picture and leave behind silver candlesticks and other valuables?" "Perhaps," suggested Miss Marple, "it wasn't the frame but what it contained that mattered." As they were leaving, they encountered Sir Thomas Hartwell arriving at the cottage, his manner agitated. Upon learning of their presence, he composed himself quickly. "I came as soon as I heard about poor Mrs. Crawford," he explained. "My wife is quite distraught." They had become friendly, you understand. "Most neighborly of you," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "I wasn't aware they were particularly acquainted." Sir Thomas adjusted his scarf with fingers that betrayed a slight tremor. "Perhaps I might be of some assistance regarding the Canterbury Psalter," he offered, deftly changing the subject. "Medieval history is something of a specialty of mine." Back at the vicarage, Sir Thomas revealed a depth of knowledge that belied his introduction as merely a retired businessman. Certain medieval manuscripts, he explained to the assembled group of Inspector Craddock, the vicar, and Miss Marple, contained more than religious texts. During periods of upheaval, particularly when the Knights Templar were being persecuted, manuscripts often concealed coded messages or maps leading to hidden relics or treasures. "Are you suggesting the Canterbury Psalter contains such information?" the vicar asked, visibly troubled. "It's certainly possible," Sir Thomas replied. "The manuscript dates from the right period, and its provenance includes several Templar-affiliated monasteries." The village, meanwhile, buzzed with fresh revelations. Lockwood, it emerged, was not who he had claimed to be. His real identity, established through fingerprint records, was Jonathan Herrick, a notorious manuscript thief wanted in 3 countries. His modus operandi had been remarkably consistent, stealing originals and replacing them with such convincing forgeries that the thefts often went undetected for months or even years. That afternoon, as Miss Marple was carefully examining the churchyard where Lockwood's body had been found, she was approached by Professor Wilkins, his academic demeanor unable to mask his evident distress. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "I fear I haven't been entirely forthcoming." He glanced around nervously before continuing. "I did recognize Lockwood or Herrick at the party. I had seen photographs in connection with investigations into manuscript thefts, but without proof I hesitated to make a public accusation." "Most understandable," Miss Marple replied, her needles momentarily still. "There's something else," the professor continued. "The Canterbury Psalter has a little-known connection to St. Mary Mead. It was originally created in the monastery that once stood where the church now exists, before being moved to Canterbury during the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. How very interesting. And does Sir Thomas Hartwell know of this connection? The professor looked startled. I haven't mentioned it to him. Why do you ask? Merely curious, Miss Marple responded, resuming her knitting. He seems remarkably well informed about medieval manuscripts for a retired businessman. As twilight descended on the village, bringing with it another flurry of snowflakes, the vicar made an unexpected discovery in the church archives, a centuries-old letter, its faded ink barely legible, referencing the true treasure of St. Mary's hidden where the light of the Holy Mother falls on the longest night. The winter solstice, Miss Marple mused when the vicar showed her the letter in the dusty church vestry. Christmas Eve, tomorrow night. Together they examined the church's stained glass windows, focusing on those depicting the Virgin Mary. The main window, a magnificent medieval piece, showing Mary cradling the infant Jesus, was positioned to catch the last rays of the setting sun on the western wall. It could mean anything. The vicar sighed, the weight of both the missing manuscript and the murder heavy on his shoulders. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, but I think we might benefit from observing that window at the specific time mentioned, sunset on the winter solstice. Returning home through the deepening snow, Miss Marple found herself uncharacteristically preoccupied. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. There was a pattern here, she was certain, a pattern as intricate as the illuminations in the missing manuscript. After a simple supper, a sudden thought prompted her to return to the church. The December evening was bitterly cold, the sky clear and pricked with stars after the earlier snowfall. As she approached the ancient building, her attention was caught by a flicker of light from within, someone moving with a lantern or flashlight. With the caution born of her years, Miss Marple slipped into the shadows of the yew trees that guarded the churchyard. From this vantage point she could observe without being seen. Through the frosted glass of the lower windows she discerned a figure moving methodically through the church, Sir Thomas Hartwell working alone, measuring angles from the main stained glass window to various points on the church floor. So absorbed was he in his task that he failed to notice another presence, a shadowy figure watching him from the choir loft above, perfectly still and silent. Miss Marple held her breath, uncertain whether to intervene. Then, as Sir Thomas finally gathered his things and prepared to leave, there came the unmistakable sound of the heavy medieval door closing, followed by the grating turn of the ancient key from the outside. In the perfect stillness of the winter night, she heard Sir Thomas's muffled exclamation of alarm as he discovered himself locked in, followed by his increasingly desperate attempts to open the unyielding door. Outside, the temperature continued to drop precipitously, the clear sky promising a night of exceptional cold. Miss Marple stood frozen in indecision. To reveal herself might expose her to whoever had locked Sir Thomas in, clearly someone who had no qualms about endangering life. Yet to leave him trapped in the unheated church on one of the coldest nights of the year could be a death sentence. As she debated, she caught a glimpse of a figure moving swiftly away from the church door, their identity concealed by the darkness and a hooded coat. Something in the gait struck her as familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. The figure disappeared down the lane toward the village, leaving no trace except rapidly filling footprints in the fresh snow. With a deep breath, Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place and moved toward the church door. Whatever secrets the Canterbury Psalter might contain, they weren't worth the price of another life. She reached for the heavy iron handle only to find it immovable. The ancient lock mechanism had been jammed from the outside with something that prevented even her spare key from working. Through the thick door she could hear Sir Thomas calling for help, his voice already weakening in the bitter cold. Miss Marple turned and, with as much haste as her elderly legs would permit, headed toward the nearest house to summon assistance. The urgency of the situation lending her strength she had not known she still possessed. Behind her the church stood silent under the stars, its secrets locked within its ancient walls along with Sir Thomas Hartwell, a man who Miss Marple was beginning to suspect knew far more about the true nature of the treasure than he had admitted to anyone in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 4. Ghosts of Christmas Past. The church caretaker, Mr. Petherick, discovered Sir Thomas at first light, huddled in the sanctuary near the altar where centuries of candles had blackened the ancient stone. Though suffering from hypothermia, Sir Thomas was conscious, a fact that the village doctor attributed to his robust constitution and the woolen overcoat he had thankfully been wearing. "Someone locked me in deliberately," Sir Thomas insisted from his hospital bed later that morning, his face still unnaturally pale against the white pillows. "I heard the key turn from the outside. Did you see who it was?" Inspector Craddock inquired, notebook at the ready. Sir Thomas shook his head, wincing at the movement. "It was already dark in the church. I was using only my flashlight, trying not to draw attention." He hesitated. "I had a particular reason for examining the church at night." "The stained glass window," Miss Marple suggested from her chair in the corner, where she sat with her ever-present knitting. "The one depicting the Virgin Mary." Sir Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, precisely. How did you—" He broke off, studying her with new interest. "A lucky guess," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Based on the vicar's discovery in the archives. In the next room of the small rural hospital, Mrs. Crawford had regained consciousness, but presented the doctors with a curious case of selective amnesia. She remembered her identity and most of her personal history, yet claimed to recall nothing of the manuscript, her visit to Miss Marple's cottage, or the attack that had left her unconscious in the snow. "A convenient lapse," observed Inspector Craddock, as he and Miss Marple left the hospital. "Though the doctors assure me it could be genuinely caused by the head trauma." "Most interesting," Miss Marple replied. "I've known similar cases. My own grandniece, after a fall from her pony, forgot an entire summer holiday, though she did eventually recover those memories when presented with her holiday photographs." Back at the police station, a telegram awaited the inspector. After reading it, he turned to Miss Marple with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Fingerprint analysis has identified another player in our drama," he explained. "Lady Hartwell is actually Catherine Blackwood, once suspected of involvement in an art theft ring operating out of Vienna and Paris. She was never charged, insufficient evidence, but her file remained active." This revelation led to an uncomfortable interview in Sir Thomas's hospital room, where Lady Hartwell, summoned to visit her husband, found herself instead confronted by Inspector Craddock. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled almost immediately. "Yes, I changed my identity," she admitted, tears running unchecked down her face. "But not because of those ridiculous theft allegations. I was escaping Leopold Brenner, a collector who became obsessed with me. The police wouldn't help. He was too wealthy, too connected. Disappearing was my only option." "And your husband?" Craddock pressed. "Does he know of your past?" "Of course," she replied, reaching for Sir Thomas's hand. "Thomas helped me escape. We met in Vienna when he was researching medieval art for his book, the one he never finished because we had to leave so suddenly." Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noted the genuine affection between the couple, and the fact that Sir Thomas appeared as surprised by the inspector's revelations as they had been, suggesting his wife's explanation contained at least elements of truth. After leaving the hospital, Miss Marple made her way to the village inn, where Professor Wilkins had taken lodgings. She found him in his room, hastily packing a leather suitcase. "Going somewhere, Professor?" she inquired mildly from the doorway. He started violently, dropping the book he had been wrapping in tissue paper. "Miss Marple, there's been an urgent communication from Oxford, a matter requiring my immediate attention." How inconvenient, she sympathized, especially with the investigation still ongoing. Her sharp eyes noted the trembling of his hands, and more tellingly, a poorly concealed cut across his right palm, precisely the type of injury one might sustain from broken glass, such as the shattered window at her own cottage the night Mrs. Crawford disappeared. "The police know I had nothing to do with any of this," he said defensively, resuming his packing with jerky movements. Their conversation was interrupted by the innkeeper, who knocked and entered with a telegram for Miss Marple. She read it quickly, her expression giving nothing away as she tucked it into her handbag. "Important news?" the professor inquired with poorly disguised anxiety. "Fingerprints," Miss Marple replied simply. "Partial prints on the manuscript page found with Dr. Lockwood's body. They've been matched to one of the Hartwell's servants. A quiet man named Barrow, I believe." "Barrow?" The professor's reaction was oddly intense. "Impossible. He stopped abruptly. "He's what, Professor?" "Nothing. I've barely spoken with the man. Just surprised, that's all." As Miss Marple departed, her mind worked busily. Professor Wilkins' reaction suggested he knew far more about Barrow than he was willing to admit, and the information about the fingerprints, a deliberate fabrication on her part, had struck home more powerfully than she had anticipated. The short December afternoon was already fading into dusk as Miss Marple approached the Bantry estate for tea, an invitation she had accepted, partly out of friendship and partly because Colonel Bantry's military connections often provided useful information. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall was warm and elegantly festive, with holly and ivy artfully arranged around family portraits, and a magnificent Christmas tree occupying one corner. "This business with the manuscript," Colonel Bantry declared as they settled with their tea, "has all the hallmarks of a professional operation, not your average village crime." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "Though I'm reminded of the case of Mrs. Trellis's diamond necklace. Everyone assumed it was taken by the London jewel thief operating in the area, when in fact it was her own nephew, the last person anyone suspected." The conversation drifted to the various individuals involved in the current mystery. When Mrs. Crawford's name was mentioned, Mrs. Bantry surprised everyone by exclaiming, "Crawford? I knew I recognized her. But her name wasn't Crawford then, of course." "You know Mrs. Crawford, Dolly?" her husband asked, startled. "Not precisely, no," Mrs. Bantry clarified, "but I attended a lecture she gave at the British Museum. Oh, it must be 8 years ago now. She was Dr. Eleanor Winters then, a specialist in medieval religious artifacts. Absolutely brilliant talk about Templar commissioned manuscripts and their hidden symbolism." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "How very interesting," she murmured. "Not the socialite background she's claimed here in St. Mary Mead." "Certainly not," Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "She was all tweed and spectacles then, not at all the glamorous figure she cuts now. I'd have never connected them if you hadn't mentioned her interest in the manuscript." As darkness settled completely over the village, Miss Marple declined the Bantry's offer of a drive home, preferring to walk the short distance and collect her thoughts. The night was clear again, stars brilliant in the black sky above the snow-covered landscape. The air held that peculiar stillness that comes with extreme cold, sounds traveling with unnatural clarity. She was nearly home when the village church bells began to ring, practicing for the Christmas Eve service planned for the following night. Their solemn tones echoed across the frozen village, a sound unchanged for centuries. Reaching her gate, Miss Marple paused. Something was not right. The cottage windows showed the lamps she had left burning, but the front door, which she distinctly remembered locking, stood very slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness against the white-painted wood. For a moment she considered seeking help, but curiosity overcame caution. With careful steps she approached her own front door and pushed it open. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed in the small entrance hall. The sitting room beyond was exactly as she had left it. The fire now burned down to embers. Yet something had changed. Her experienced eyes scanned the familiar room, coming to rest finally on the mantelpiece. There, placed deliberately in the center where it could not be missed, stood a small carved wooden box that had certainly not been there when she left. With steady hands that belied her racing thoughts, Miss Marple opened the box. Inside lay an ancient iron key, its design primitive yet unmistakably crafted for a specific lock. Beneath it was a folded note, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting spidery and faded. The treasure hunter becomes the hunted. Midnight in the Lady Chapel. Miss Marple moved immediately to her telephone, intending to contact Inspector Craddock. But the line was dead. The heavy snow had brought down telephone lines across the village, leaving St. Mary Mead temporarily isolated from outside communication. The church bells had fallen silent, but now began again, marking the hour. With a glance at her clock, Miss Marple realized it was already 11. The Christmas Eve service would begin in an hour. Despite the recent disturbances, a decision formed in her mind. Returning to the hall, she took down her warmest coat and wrapped a thick scarf around her neck. From a drawer, she retrieved a small flashlight kept for emergencies, then the ancient key secured in her pocket. She stepped out once more into the crystal clarity of the winter night. Whatever revelation awaited in the Lady Chapel, Miss Marple intended to be there to witness it. As she made her careful way along the snow-covered lane, the old nursery rhyme about the spider and the fly came unbidden to her mind. She was walking knowingly into what was almost certainly a trap, but sometimes, she reflected, that was the only way to catch the one who set it. Chapter 5. The Winter's Longest Night. The church of St. Mary Mead stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its medieval tower reaching toward heaven as it had done for centuries. Through stained glass windows, candlelight flickered, casting jewel-like patterns on the snow outside. The Christmas Eve service had drawn a smaller congregation than usual, the combination of treacherous weather and recent disturbing events keeping many villagers safely behind their locked doors. Miss Marple slipped quietly through the side entrance, careful to avoid drawing attention. The main body of the church was illuminated by candles, and the ancient chandeliers, their light insufficient to fully dispel the shadows in the high corners of the nave. The vicar's voice echoed as he read from the Gospel of Luke, the familiar Christmas story providing an incongruous backdrop to the tension Miss Marple felt. Unnoticed by the congregation, she made her way to the Lady Chapel, a small side chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, separated from the main church by an intricately carved wooden screen. Inside, the space was empty, save for a single candle burning on the small altar, its flame causing shadows to dance across the walls, adorned with faded medieval frescoes. Above the altar hung the stained glass window. The vicar had shown her a depiction of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus, rendered in deep blues and crimson glass that appeared almost black in the dimness. Miss Marple positioned herself in a corner, partially concealed by a stone pillar, and waited. As the service continued in the main church, the vicar's voice rising and falling in familiar cadences, she observed how the moonlight now streamed through the stained glass, creating patterns on the chapel floor that shifted subtly as clouds occasionally passed before the moon. There was something deliberate about the design, she realized, something that would only be visible at this precise time on the winter solstice. Her attention was drawn to a particular spot where moonlight illuminated a seemingly unremarkable stone in the floor. Moving closer, her keen eyes discerned what others might miss, a small, almost invisible keyhole in the ancient flagstone, perfectly positioned to catch the colored light from Mary's robe in the window above. The sound of the chapel door opening caused her to retreat back into the shadows. Professor Wilkins entered, his scholarly appearance at odds with the cold determination now evident in his bearing. Behind him came another figure, Barrow the Hartwell's quiet servant, though his demeanor now suggested a different profession entirely. His eyes scanned the chapel with the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to assessing threats. Miss Marple, Wilkins spoke quietly into the apparent emptiness.
"I know you're here."
"The game of hide and seek is rather beneath us both, don't you think?" She stepped forward with dignity, her back straight, despite her years. "Good evening, Professor, and Mr. Barrow, isn't it? Though I suspect that's not your real name." The key, if you please, Wilkins continued, ignoring her observation. A simple exchange, your life for a piece of metal that means nothing to you, but it means everything to the rightful owners, came a voice from the chapel entrance. Sir Thomas Hartwell stood there, considerably paler than usual, but standing unaided, his expression resolute. The Brotherhood has protected the secret for centuries. We won't allow it to be stolen now. Ah, Sir Thomas, Wilkins smiled without warmth. Recovered from your chilly evening communion, I see. How fortunate, now we're only missing.
Me,
said Mrs. Crawford, stepping from behind Sir Thomas. Gone was any trace of the glamorous socialite or the confused hospital patient. Her posture was confident, her eyes sharp and focused, though I believe you know me better as Dr. Winters. The gang's all here, Barrow murmured, his hand moving subtly toward his pocket. I wouldn't, advised a new voice, as Inspector Craddock emerged from behind the altar screen, service revolver in hand. Police, don't move. For a moment, the tableau held, each person frozen in place like figures in a medieval painting, their faces illuminated by the strange combination of candlelight and moonlight filtering through colored glass. Well, Miss Marple broke the silence, her tone conversational. Perhaps now would be a good time to explain what exactly has been happening in our village. Beginning, I think, with what the Canterbury Psalter has to do with all this. Sir Thomas nodded. The Psalter was never the true target. It was brought to St. Mary Mead deliberately, as part of an elaborate plan to locate the true treasure. He gestured toward the illuminated flagstone, a Templar artifact hidden in this church since the 14th century. The manuscript contained coded instructions visible only when exposed to specific light conditions on the winter solstice, exactly as we're seeing now. How delightfully medieval, commented Wilkins, his academic interest apparently genuine despite the circumstances. But you're only partially correct. The manuscript itself is valuable, certainly, but it was the map hidden within its illuminations that brought us all here. Us? Queried Miss Marple gently. Professor Wilkins, Inspector Craddock supplied, is actually Robert Farrington, suspected head of an international ring of art thieves. He's been using his academic position as cover for years. And Barrow? Miss Marple inquired. Security specialist, Barrow answered for himself with professional pride. Former military, I handle the logistics of acquisition and transportation, which leaves Dr. Lockwood, or should I say Herrick, Miss Marple continued. Your authentication expert, I presume, the one who created the forgeries to replace what you stole until he decided to betray us. Wilkins confirmed coldly. He discovered something about the Psalter, something he didn't share with the rest of us. When I confronted him at the vicarage, he was already planning to take the manuscript and find the treasure himself. So you killed him, Miss Marple stated simply. A regrettable business necessity, Wilkins shrugged. The letter opener was merely the nearest implement at hand. Sir Thomas stepped forward, his expression grave. What Herrick discovered was the connection between the Psalter and my family. The Hartwells, or Hartfields as we were known then, were entrusted by the last Templar Grand Master to protect certain artifacts of significance, objects that, in the wrong hands, could be dangerous. Dangerous? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Or valuable? Both, interjected Mrs. Crawford, or Dr. Winters. That's why I came to St. Mary Mead when I learned the Psalter would be exhibited here. I've spent my career studying Templar artifacts, trying to ensure they're preserved properly in museums, not exploited by private collectors. She cast a meaningful glance at Wilkins. And your connection to all this, Sir Thomas? Miss Marple inquired. Beyond your family history? Thomas has been working with me, Dr. Winters explained. When we discovered Wilkins' organization was targeting the Psalter, we planned to find the treasure first and move it to safety. A touching alliance, Wilkins commented sardonically, though you neglected to mention how you staged your own attack and memory loss to throw suspicion elsewhere. Quite the performance at the hospital. As the explanations continued, Miss Marple observed the shifting moonlight on the floor. The pattern was changing as the moon moved, the keyhole becoming less distinct with each passing minute. Whatever window of opportunity existed would soon close, perhaps for another year. "The key, Miss Marple," Wilkins demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We've indulged this drawing-room denouement long enough." "Actually," Miss Marple replied calmly, "I've been wondering about something else entirely. You see, we still haven't established who locked Sir Thomas in the church last night, a rather cruel act that might have resulted in death. An unfortunate necessity," Burroughs stated flatly. "He was getting too close." "Yet you, Professor, were with me at approximately that time," Miss Marple pointed out, "which means someone else was involved." As she spoke, Miss Marple moved slightly, positioning herself directly in the beam of colored light falling from the window. The ancient key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if responding to its proximity to the lock it was designed for. "Enough!" Wilkins stepped forward suddenly, his academic demeanor dropping away completely. "The key now, or—" The chapel door burst open with a bang that echoed through the small space. In the doorway stood Lady Hartwell, a service revolver held steadily in her gloved hands. "Step away from her," she commanded, her voice no longer that of a society hostess, but sharp with authority. "Catherine," Sir Thomas began, "you shouldn't be here." "Catherine Blackwood died years ago," she replied without taking her eyes off Wilkins. "My name is Julia Hartfield, Special Branch. I've been tracking Farrington's operation for nearly a decade." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the chapel. Wilkins, or Farrington, recovered first, his face contorting with fury as he lunged toward Miss Marple. In the confusion that followed, several things happened at once. Lady Hartwell fired a warning shot that echoed deafeningly in the confined space. Inspector Craddock moved to intercept Barrow, who had produced a knife from somewhere, and Sir Thomas shouted a warning as the ancient floor beneath them seemed to shift. Suddenly the chapel was plunged into darkness as the candle was extinguished. Through the stained glass, only moonlight remained, casting strange colored patterns across the struggling figures. Miss Marple found herself pressed against the wall, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. Next to her, someone breathed heavily. "Dr. Winters," she thought, though in the darkness it was impossible to be certain. A shot rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Someone, a man, cried out in pain. Then came the unmistakable sound of a body falling heavily to the stone floor. When light was restored moments later, Inspector Craddock having found and relit the candle, Professor Wilkins lay dead at the foot of the altar. Protruding from his chest was an ornate dagger, identical to the one that had pinned the manuscript page to Mrs. Crawford's pillow. The ancient key that Miss Marple had been holding was now clutched in his lifeless hand, and his unseeing eyes stared up at the stained glass window where the Virgin's face was perfectly illuminated by the moonlight. Miss Marple surveyed the scene with sorrow rather than surprise. Human nature, she had long maintained, was much the same everywhere, even in places of worship on the holiest of nights. It was only as the inspector began to establish order that she realized Sir Thomas and Barrow were nowhere to be seen, having vanished as completely as if the ancient stones had swallowed them whole. Chapter 6. Epiphany. The days between Christmas and New Year's brought heavy snowfall to St. Mary Mead, effectively isolating the village from the outside world. Roads became impassable, telephone lines remained down, and the inhabitants found themselves thrown back to a simpler time, much, Miss Marple reflected, like the medieval period when the church was built and the treasure hidden. In this enforced peace, she had time to gather the loose threads of the mystery, knitting them together with the same precision she applied to the blue wool scarf, taking shape beneath her needles. By the time the roads were sufficiently cleared to allow movement again, she had requested Inspector Craddock to gather the remaining participants in the vicarage drawing room, the same room where events had begun a week earlier. The fire crackled in the grate as they assembled. Inspector Craddock, the vicar and his wife, Dr. Winters, no longer maintaining her Mrs. Crawford persona, and Lady Hartwell, or rather Julia Hartfield of Special Branch. Notably absent were Sir Thomas and Barrow, whose disappearance remained unexplained. "I've asked you here," Miss Marple began, her knitting needles clicking steadily, "because I believe we all deserve to understand exactly what happened and why a peaceful village Christmas was disrupted by theft, deception, and murder." She turned to the vicar. "Perhaps we should begin with the Canterbury Psalter itself." The vicar nodded and crossed to a concealed wall safe behind a painting of his predecessor. From it, he withdrew the manuscript, perfectly intact, and placed it carefully on the table. "The manuscript was never stolen," Miss Marple explained to the surprised faces. "It was hidden by the vicar himself when he realized the danger, replaced with a convincing forgery created years ago by Dr. Lockwood, or Herrick, as we now know him. The forgery was what disappeared during the Christmas party." "But how did you know?" Lady Hartfield asked, genuine admiration in her voice. "Two small details," Miss Marple replied. "First, the vicar's hands when he discovered the theft. They showed no trace of the special powder that had been applied to the display case as a security measure. Second, having spent many hours in this vicarage over the years, I was aware of the safe, though its contents were, of course, confidential." She continued, her gaze moving around the room. "Dr. Lockwood came to St. Mary Mead specifically to find the Templar treasure. He used his position as village doctor to search for clues without suspicion. When he learned the Psalter would be exhibited here, he planned to steal it, knowing it contained coded directions to the hiding place. But then he discovered Professor Wilkins and Barrow were pursuing the same goal," Inspector Craddock added. "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "And that leads us to the first murder, Doctor. Lockwood wasn't killed where we found him. He was murdered in the vicarage study when he attempted to steal the forgery. Then his body was moved to the churchyard. The page in his hand was a deliberate misdirection planted by his killer." Lady Hartfield leaned forward. "You've been remarkably well informed throughout this case, Miss Marple, almost as if you knew what was happening before it occurred." "Not at all," Miss Marple demurred. "I simply observe human nature changes very little over the centuries. Greed, fear, ambition, they manifest in similar patterns regardless of the setting." She paused, looking directly at Lady Hartfield. "Your true identity was perhaps the most difficult to discern, though your marksmanship in the Lady Chapel suggested professional training beyond what most society hostesses would possess." The woman acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head. "I've been embedded in this operation for years." Catherine Blackwood's background provided the perfect cover to get close to Farrington's network. "When we learned they were targeting the Psalter, I orchestrated our move to St. Mary Mead." She glanced toward the door with a flicker of concern. "Though I never anticipated Thomas would become so personally involved. Because of his family connection to the Knights Templar," Miss Marple supplied, "a connection that proved to be genuine despite the many other deceptions in this case." "Yes," Lady Hartfield confirmed. "That part was unexpected. The Hartwell, or rather Hartfield, lineage truly does trace back to the Templars. Thomas became determined to protect what he considered his ancestral duty. Which brings us to Dr. Winters." Miss Marple turned to the historian. "Your performance as Mrs. Crawford was quite convincing, especially your staged attack and memory loss." Dr. Winters smiled ruefully. "Professional necessity. When I realized how many players were converging on St. Mary Mead, I needed to operate with more freedom. A hospitalized victim is often overlooked as a suspect." "Yet you were genuine in your desire to protect the artifacts," Miss Marple observed. "Absolutely," Dr. Winters confirmed. "These aren't merely valuable antiquities, they're irreplaceable historical records. In the wrong hands they could be damaged, destroyed, or hidden away in private collections where scholars would never access them." "And that brings us to the critical question," Inspector Craddock interjected. "What happened to Sir Thomas and Barrow, and more importantly, what happened to the treasure?" At this, the vicar cleared his throat. "Perhaps I can shed some light on that matter," He rose and moved to a side table where a wooden box sat covered with a cloth. "This morning, I found this in the church. It was placed on the altar with a note requesting I bring it here today." He removed the cloth to reveal an ancient wooden container, its surface darkened with age and carved with symbols that appeared to be a combination of Christian and older, more esoteric designs. The box was sealed with a modern padlock, to which a small key was attached. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "that you'll find that key was left by Sir Thomas." The vicar opened the padlock and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet that was clearly a more recent addition, lay a collection of small objects: a sealed parchment scroll, a medallion bearing Templar symbols, and what appeared to be a tiny reliquary of gold and crystal. "The treasure," Dr. Winters breathed, leaning forward with professional interest. "Not gold or jewels as Farrington believed, but something far more valuable to historians: sacred texts and artifacts, salvaged during the Crusades. And this," the vicar added, removing an envelope from beneath the box. "Addressed to you, Miss Marple." She accepted it with a slight nod and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in a firm, educated hand. "Miss Marple, by the time you read this, Barrow and I will be far from St. Mary Mead. Your perspicacity has earned you the truth. Barrow is not what he appeared. His real name is Martin Fletcher, formerly of British intelligence, now working as a private security consultant for museums, recovering stolen artifacts. He had infiltrated Farrington's organization years ago, just as my wife infiltrated from another angle. The treasures enclosed are but a sample, proof of their existence and authenticity. The remainder have been secured in a location known only to those with the appropriate lineage and training. They will eventually find their way to the British Museum, though through channels that cannot be traced back to St. Mary Mead or the events of this Christmas. My wife will explain where her duty takes her next. Please know that what appeared to be deception was, in its own way, a different kind of protection, of history, of knowledge, and of those who might be harmed by its misuse. With sincere admiration, Sir Thomas Hartfield." "Well," Inspector Craddock said, after Miss Marple had read the letter aloud, "that answers some questions, though I dare say the full story is more complex than any of us have pieced together." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though one mystery remains: who killed Professor Wilkins or Farrington in the Lady Chapel? In the darkness and confusion, it was impossible to determine." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the gentle click of Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their rhythm. "Does it matter?" Lady Hartfield asked eventually. "He was a murderer and thief, responsible for incalculable damage to cultural heritage across Europe." "Justice matters," Miss Marple replied simply, "even perhaps especially at Christmas." Lady Hartfield held her gaze for a long moment before nodding almost imperceptibly. "The official report will indicate that Farrington was killed while resisting arrest, a struggle for Inspector Craddock's weapon, resulting in an accidental discharge, an explanation that conveniently absolves everyone present," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Sometimes, Miss Marple," Lady Hartfield responded, "the truth serves nobody, not the living, nor the dead, nor the cause of justice itself." As the gathering dispersed, the vicar mentioned an interesting footnote to the case. Among the documents in the box was a family tree linking the Hartfield lineage directly to a Templar knight who had guarded these same treasures centuries earlier. "A remarkable coincidence," commented Inspector Craddock. "I don't believe in coincidences," Miss Marple replied. "In my experience, what appears to be chance is often the result of generations of purpose." Later, as New Year's Eve approached, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, watching the artifacts being carefully packed by Dr. Winters and a colleague from the British Museum, who had finally managed to reach the village. The snow outside had begun again, large flakes drifting past her window in the early dusk. "Human nature doesn't change, does it?" she observed to Dr. Winters, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. Greed, loyalty, fear, love, the same motivations that drove people centuries ago drive us still. That's what makes old secrets so dangerous. They're never truly buried as long as someone remembers them. Dr. Winters looked up from her careful wrapping of the reliquary. Do you think the full treasure will ever surface? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, though I suspect Sir Thomas, or whatever his real name might be, will ensure it emerges only when the world is ready to receive it properly. As the last of the artifacts was secured in a special transport case, Miss Marple moved to her window. The snow was falling more heavily now, already covering the footprints of those who had visited her cottage, erasing all evidence of their presence just as time would eventually obscure the events of this unusual Christmas. The greatest mystery, she added thoughtfully, isn't what lies hidden in the past, but what people will do when that past threatens to emerge. In that way, every old secret creates new ones, like ripples in a pond that never quite fade away. Outside, the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to the New Year's Eve service. The medieval tower stood firm against the darkening sky, its stones harboring countless secrets accumulated over 8 centuries, some now revealed, others still waiting for their appointed time. And Miss Marple, who had seen enough of human nature to understand both its darkness and its capacity for redemption, knew that some mysteries were perhaps better left unsolved, at least for now. As she prepared to join the village for the service, she reflected that mysteries, like Christmas itself, often contained elements of both the divine and the all-too-human, faith and doubt, greed and generosity, deception and truth, all wrapped together in the endless complexity of human experience. And in that knowledge, paradoxically, she found a kind of peace.